Okay, so you're telling me that around 1926 is the last kind of high-ranking Jew in the Communist Party or something like that?
No, the last one appointed to the Politburo.
Uh-huh.
So there were existing Jewish members of the Politburo, but from about 1926 on, and then it increases in waves, especially in the later 1930s, and then again after 1948. There are periodic, not just attempts, but campaigns to essentially de-Judaize the leadership and the membership of the Bolshevik Party, so of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. So Kaganovich in 1926 is the last one appointed to the Politburo, and he lasts till well into the 40s, maybe even into the early 50s, maybe even into the 50s. I don't remember. But from time to time, but then you begin. There's some resentment of Jews for being in salient positions in the party. So the party begins to de-Judaize as it brings in more children and descendants of peasants and workers. So it becomes less Jewish in the course of the 1920s. Then in the years right before the Second World War, in the course of the purges in 1936 to 1938, there were Jews who were prosecutors in the purges, and there were lots of Jews who were purged. And sometimes they were the same people. That is, first they would be among the purgers, then they would be among the purged. But by the time of the Second World War, you have far fewer Jews in the Bolshevik administration. And then that stops for a while, and then in 1948, it begins again even more vehemently until by the time of Stalin's death in 1953, he has this belief that Jewish doctors are plotting against him, and he was about to not only did they put Jewish doctors on trial, but he had a plan that wasn't realized because he died first to deport a lot of the Jews to Siberia.
Wow. And what's going on in Europe and the United States in like the 20s and 30s? I mean, we have people like Karl Kautsky and Emma Goldman,
Mhm.
and then we have a huge anti-Bolshevik backlash, I guess, in the United States and Europe. You want to talk about what's going on there?
Sure. Well, there are various stages. First of all, remember in the period right after the First World War, so in late 1918 and early 1919, you have a series of abortive radical leftist revolutions in Berlin, where one of the key people involved is Rosa Luxemburg, who's of Jewish origin, in Munich, where one of the key people, a number of the key figures are of Jewish origin, um, and even more so in Hungary, where for about 188 days in 1919, there was a communist regime headed by a man by the name of Bela Kun, in which Jews were heavily overrepresented. Now, I have to be careful when I use the term Jews, because it's important to keep in mind that all the people that I'm talking about who one would call Jews who were involved with communism, they were almost to a man and woman people who were antipathetic to who were either trying to escape their Jewish origins. They were certainly entirely non-religious, and by and large, they were not just non-religious, but they were anti-religious, and that was an important part of Bolshevism. I don't know if this is going to work, but many decades ago, my parents bought for me at auction a set of can you see this? A set of communist playing cards
Yeah.
from Russia in the 1920s. And here, I can't see myself. So here you can, so the face of the Joker looks like this. So as you can see at the top, you see that capitalist in the top hat?
Yeah.
And he's holding the strings and manipulating a Catholic priest, an Orthodox priest, a rabbi, and and I think a Muslim clergyman. And then if you look at the kings, so this is their conception of what a religious Jew looked like. You can see he's got the wrong number of candles for the Sabbath, but that shows you the extent of their knowledge. But this was, you can see that he's with the back of his hand that's in the back. He's getting that money from the bourgeois. And there are a number of other playing cards. The jacks. This is their conception of what a rabbi looked like, and he's looking at the candles, but he's actually thinking about a woman, and so on. And these face cards exist also for Russian Orthodoxy and for Catholicism and for Islam, but I show them to you mainly just to bring out the fact that that when we talk about Jewish Bolsheviks, we mean people of Jewish origin, but not people who identified in any sense as Jews. Okay, getting back to the other countries. So you had these abortive revolutions where Jews were overrepresented at the top, even though most Jews were very antipathetic to these revolutions. But that created the myth of the Jew as Bolshevik. Which was, there were a number of books that were written about it shortly after these abortive revolutions. They were written, some were written in French, some were written in German. They're quickly translated into English and other languages. And they begin to influence public opinion in a wide variety of countries. So in the United States, you had Henry Ford's Dearborn Independent, which was a newspaper that he funded, and it circulated anti-Semitism connected to anti-Bolshevism was an important part of its message. And indeed, the immigration restrictions that occur in the United States in 1924, the Reed-Johnson Act that essentially stops immigration from Eastern Europe, one of the motives behind it, not the only one, was the notion that the people who are coming in were communists and Jewish communists. So you have then this myth of the Jew as Bolshevik, which, as I hope I've made clear, is based on a really distortion of the actual evidence, but it becomes quite influential. And then Jews were overrepresented in a lot of communist parties outside of Russia. So they were the two groups that were most overrepresented in the United States Communist Party in the 1920s and 1930s. The Jews were the second most overrepresented group. You have any idea what the first overrepresented group was? It was
I'll guess blacks, but
No, it was actually Finns. There were Finnish American miners in the Midwest were part of the backbone of the membership of the Communist Party. And Jews were overrepresented, but again, Jews in the United States in that period tended to be left of center. But those who were tended to be primarily, first they had been Republicans, and then after 1928, more of them were Democrats, and then there were smaller groups that were part of that were socialists, but those who were socialists tended to be social democrats, so supporters of Norman Thomas. And there were still smaller group that were in the Communist Party, where there too they tended to be overrepresented in leadership positions. And then in the period in the later 1930s, before 1939, you had a small trickle of Jews, a larger trickle of Jews into the Communist Party at a time when the Soviet Union was seen as the major bulwark against Nazi Germany. And then after the signing of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact in August of 1939, when the international communist movement becomes essentially pacifist because because of that pact, Jews are disappointed and move out of the party. And then in 1941, when the Soviet Union becomes a major ally of the United States, you have more Jews moving into the Communist Party. Again, when I say more Jews, I'm talking about small numbers of people, but it's a small party by and large in the United States. And so even a small number of Jews can be overrepresented there. And then the story goes on.
Oh, can I
We can get to the period after the Second World War in Eastern Europe, which is a fascinating story in and of itself, but I don't know how much you want to go there, Arnold.
Well, I want to go to, let's say, let's go to the United States in the 50s and so on.
Yeah.
And that's a period where it seems like everything revolves around communism. Like everyone who's in politics or voicing a political opinion has to position themselves relative to communism. So you might have a few people who are for, or they are anti-communist, as they call themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have things like the Americans for Democratic Action, which is, the left of the Democratic Party, but strictly anti-communist.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the Republicans trying to exploit anti-communism. That's kind of where I come in some sense. I'm pretty young in the 50s, so I'm not aware of things, but the 50s and the 60s just seem to be, that is the central issue of our time, as it were. Is that a fair reading of the intellectual atmosphere in the US, the 50s and 60s?
Yes, in the 50s and the early 60s, the mid 60s, yes. So in that period, of course, you had Jews who had been communists during the war. Most of them left the party thereafter. One of the most salient cases, though, in the 1950s, in 1952-53, I think, were the Rosenbergs, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, Brooklyn Jews who were spies for the Soviet Union. They were charged with having stolen the secrets of the atom bomb. In fact, the main spy who had done that was a man by the name of Klaus Fuchs, who was a German emigre physicist who had worked on the Manhattan Project and so on. But the Rosenbergs did what they could to steal secrets about the atomic bomb and convey them to the Soviets. Now, during that trial period, there's a very good book about them, about 20 years old already now, by Ronald Radosh. The communist movement in the United States tried to rally Jews on the grounds that the Rosenbergs were being persecuted because they were Jewish. But in fact, they weren't being persecuted because they were Jewish. They were being prosecuted because they were spies. And Jews were very involved in anti-communism. So the judge at the Rosenberg trial was Jewish. The prosecutor, one of the main prosecutors, was Jewish. Jews in the socialist movement, what was left of it, or those who joined the left wing of the Republican Party, like Americans for Democratic Action, as you say, they were highly anti-communist. That was a central part of their identity. And then you had major Jewish intellectuals, I mean, up and coming Jewish intellectuals in the 1950s, like Daniel Bell and Irving Kristol and people like that, that were key figures in the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was an international organization of liberal anti-communist intellectuals. And then you had Jews on the around McCarthy. They were Jews around McCarthy. Um, uh, what's his name? Cohen and David Schein. These were, I'm blanking on Cohen's first name. It'll come back to me. These were leading figures around McCarthy who, of course, tried to ride the anti-communist wave. And the organized American Jewish community in the 1950s was also highly, oh yeah, Roy Cohen, thank you, was highly anti-communist. So the American Jewish Committee, for example, which sponsored the then new magazine Commentary, was highly anti-communist, and Commentary itself in those years was highly anti-communist. So there were small pockets of Jewish communists left in the United States and in Canada. When I was growing up in Niagara Falls, Ontario, there was one man who was known to be who belonged to a Jewish communist organization. I once went to visit him at his house, and he showed me the Yiddish newspaper published in the Soviet Union out of Bijan, which was this attempt to create in the 1930s on a Jewish area in Siberia. So there were small pockets of such people, but very few of them. There was a journal in the United States called Jewish Currents, which was published by Morris U. Shappies, which was a pro-communist magazine. But then, like many communists, after the death of Stalin and the revelations about Stalin's murderousness, Morris U. Shappies also left the communist orbit. So by the time you get into the mid 1950s, there are almost no Jewish communists left. Now, there are a few here and there. David Horowitz, now a right-wing Trumpist publicist, comes from a communist family and wrote about it very eloquently. There's a fellow by the name of Stanley Levison, who was really the right-hand man, the political advisor to Martin Luther King Jr., who had been a prominent member of the American Communist Party, was also of Jewish origin. So you do have a few of them here or there, but they're very thin on the ground by the mid 1950s. And as I say, and Jews are very prominent in anti-communist liberalism.
Okay, so I think I want to invite people to raise physical or virtual hands with questions. And I want to throw one last thing. So what is the new left? Does it connect to communism? Does it connect Jews to communism? Maybe talk about that. And meanwhile, if people have come up with questions, they can raise virtual or actual hands.
Yeah. So there are various streams that flow into the New Left. There's, for example, Tom Hayden, who was the main person who wrote the Ann Arbor Declaration, I think it was called, which was one of the founding documents of the New Left.
Port Huron Statement.
The Port Huron Statement. That's it. Thank you. He's not Jewish, but Jews were heavily overrepresented in the New Left. Some of those were what were called red diaper babies. That is, people who were the children of parents who either were communists or more often had been communists, became non-communist and more upper middle class in the course of the 1950s and 1960s, and then some of their children rebelled against them by adopting a more leftist position. The New Left was, by and large, not communist. I mean, that was what was new about it, is that they tried to distinguish themselves both from older social democratic trends, but also they were non-communist, at least at their founding. They did, however, in their anti-communism, some of them did over time come to support the communist regime the communist side in Vietnam, the Viet Cong, and so on. So you do have often a kind of genealogical lineage between former communists and their children who go into the New Left. Uh, and as I say, Jews were certainly overrepresented in the New Left, especially in its first years. Todd Gitlin wrote a good history of the New Left, in which he talks about this fact, but that as the New Left developed, it became ever less intellectual and ever more violent and ever less Jewish over the course of its development. Whoops, I can't hear you, Arnold.
Okay, I don't see any hands raised, but I can throw a little bit. Okay, so Tom, want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I actually couldn't find where to raise my hand.
Oh yeah, they've changed the layout of this. I've had a hard time finding chat. I had a hard time finding record. I don't know, it's weird.
I wanted to ask Jerry a little bit about the 1800s and Zionism.
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of went into the communism, but and you talked about the social democrats, but I had the feeling that the religious Jews, many of them, also became Zionists and socialists.
No, that's not really true, Tom. So the important thing to understand, Zionism, it has its precursors in the 1860s and 1870s. It really starts to develop in the 1880s, and it is largely it's a minority movement for a long time among Jews. It's primarily made up of Jews who, though they often had a good Jewish background, people who were really revolting against the kind of Orthodox Judaism of their day. So they saw Orthodox Judaism, quite rightly, as by and large politically passive. They also thought it intellectually implausible. And they thought that in the face of rising ethnic nationalism in much of Europe, certainly in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, that they saw that Jews were increasingly being excluded in modernizing societies that were becoming more capitalist. So Jews had been disproportionately involved in commerce in those countries, and as you had the rise of non-Jewish middle classes, they were often trying to squeeze out the Jews, and of course you had anti-Semitic violence in Russia in the form of pogroms at the end of the century, at the time of the Dreyfus trial in France, and so on. So Zionists at the time were primarily Jews who saw that in a world in which ethnic nationalism was rising, Jews were going to be ever more marginalized and threatened in their polities. And they thought that Jews needed to do two things. They needed to have a polity of their own, ultimately a state of their own, and they needed to transform themselves so that they weren't just involved in petty commerce. And they wanted to create a Jewish farmers, Jewish workers, and so on in the land of Israel, in what was then Ottoman Palestine and in British Palestine. So Zionism, for the most part, was non-religious or anti-religious. Now there was a small tendency of Orthodox Jews who were Zionist, but that was a minority position within the Zionist movement and very much a minority among Orthodox Jews. In terms of religious Jews and socialism, and many of these Zionists, not all of them, but many of them were socialists of various stripes, of a kind of anti-Bolshevik type. Somebody put up a query here, Mark Kaufman. My impression has long been that until recent years, about 80% of the kibbutzim in Israel were indeed both Zionist and socialist/communist. About 20% were religious Orthodox kibbutzim. Okay, and certainly not socialist. So a couple of things. First of all, the kibbutz movement was certainly very important in the Jewish settlement in mandatory Palestine and in the first 20 or 30 years of the state of Israel from 1948 on. They were, for the most part, non-communist and anti-communist, but there were one of the trends there were three socialist Zionist trends that had their own kibbutzim. One of those trends, the one affiliated with what was called the political party of Mapam, had been favorable towards the Soviet Union and indeed had pictures of Stalin up in their kibbutzim from 1948 to about 1953. There was also a tiny communist party to the left of them. There was a tiny communist party in Israeli politics itself. I can go more into that if you're interested. The Orthodox kibbutzim, as you say, were a small percentage of the kibbutzim. I think 20% sounds about right. They were socialist in the sense that they were not anti-religious. They were Orthodox. I lived on one myself for several months when I was a teenager in 1973. But they were socialist in the sense that property there was collectively owned and everybody their work was doled out by a manager who was a member of the kibbutz and so on. So they did combine socialism, not on the national or international sense, with Zionism and with Orthodoxy. They were very nice places to live, and some of them still exist and are very nice places to live.
So if you were to update Israeli politics, you've had this, really starting with voting in Begin, you had the Mizrahi, the Jews who came from the Middle East and just have a very different outlook than the sort of the socialist Zionists. And I gather there's still quite a fault line there, and it showed up recently in the judicial reform where the former socialists or left parties in Israel got very upset about that, and until October 7th, that was the big fault line.
Well, it's true that the Jews who came from the Muslim world, the so-called Mizrahim, who make up now, I think, just under half of the Israeli population, they didn't have this legacy either of European liberalism or of the Enlightenment or of the Jewish Enlightenment, and many of them they came from Orthodox backgrounds, but they weren't so much Orthodox as what's called in Israel traditional Masorati. They certainly didn't have a soft spot in their hearts for any kind of socialist ideology. And they came from about 1949 through the early to mid 1950s. And then, of course, in the 1980s, in the very early 1990s, you had a large wave of immigration of Jews from the former Soviet Union. And they were vehemently not just anti-communist, but anti-socialist. And both of those groups increasingly play a role in Israeli politics. The Mizrahim, the Jews from the Arab world, did see themselves as having been subordinated to the Ashkenazi, that is the European Jewish parties that had been socialist, the Israeli Labor Party and so on, and they did sort of get their political voice, as you say, with the election of Menachem Begin in 1978 as the head of the Likud party. You couldn't be more Ashkenazi than Menachem Begin, but he managed to mobilize this voting base of Jews from the Arab world who felt that they had been marginalized. That division is much less now than it was at the time of Begin's election, in part because of just higher degrees of intermarriage between Jews of European and Jews of Middle Eastern origin. But it's still there, and they still are disproportionately represented among right-of-center voters. And even in the radical right, somebody like Ben Gvir, who's the head of this small but really pernicious radical right religious party, his family is from among the Mizrahim. So that continues to play a role. And yes, those people tended to be non-socialist or anti-socialist. It's true.
Okay. Sorry, Dennis, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, a couple weeks ago, Arnold had a Substack post where he talked about his own family history, and there was this, I think, claim that Jews lean left or progressive. And I have the same impression, but two questions. One is there any good data about that? And two, if so, what do you attribute that to? Arnold said, urbanization might have something to do with it, and wondered what you thought about.
Yes, well, it varies a lot, obviously, from over time, and it varies a lot from one country to another. So in Western Europe, for example, in Britain and France, Jews tend to vote for what in Europe is called liberal parties. That is, parties that are in favor of complete separation of church and state, equality before the law, market orientation, and so on. So more British Jews, for example, vote for the Conservative Party than for the Labour Party. In the and again, as I mentioned before, in much of Europe, certainly up to the Second World War, parties that were right of center, and especially the further right you moved, the more ethno-nationalist they were, and they defined the Jews as outside of the real nation, right? Now, in the United States, my understanding is Jews tended to vote Republican till the election of 1928, when a variety of things started to happen and more ethnic groups started to come into the Democratic Party. There was a powerful Jewish labor movement in the period from before the First World War through the 1920s and 1930s. That was at a time when a lot of Jews were in the needle trades as workers under some of the really some of the worst working conditions, and Jews were involved in labor unions at the time that were social democratic in their orientation. Sorry, well, tell me your question again so I can go back to it.
Well, I wondered
Oh, about Jews in
what
the
you,
left. Yes, yes, yes.
yeah, why?
In terms of American Jewish voting patterns, you know, ever since the 1930s, Jews have tended to vote disproportionately for the Democratic Party. They've also been important in the funding of the Democratic Party. As time has gone on, for a variety of reasons, they've become increasingly important in funding the Republican Party, and more Jews have voted Republican, especially among Orthodox Jews. So basically, the more religiously right-wing they are, the more they tend to vote for the Republican Party. Whereas most Jews tend to be not part of the radical left, but just the slightly left of center in the Democratic Party. So all of that is kind of now up in the air. I think were it not for Trump, you'd have more of a movement of Jewish votes into the Republican Party. But that's, that corresponds to the larger alienation of the educated middle classes from the Republican Party under Trump. Yeah, so those are the trends.
Had a question. It was about, Ayn Rand. I think there are several key Jewish intellectuals on the kind of far right, I would say, like Milton Friedman, Ayn Rand, Murray Rothbard. You could even
Ludwig
count
von Mises.
Ludwig von Mises.
Yes. So these tended to be people who were, I would say, entirely alienated from anything Jewish. People
and alienated from Jewish politics, really.
Yes, alienated from Judaism in any sense. I mean, Mises was from, I think, a family that had, I think he himself had converted to some form of Christianity early on. Ayn Rand, didn't have a Jewish bone in her body except genetically. Rothbard also had no, to the best of my knowledge, had no Jewish interests. There's a very good new biography of Milton Friedman that I recently read. He was of Jewish origin, of course, and it certainly played some role in the development of his thinking. Not Judaism per se in any sense, but the sociological condition of Jews did. But he himself had very few Jewish affinities. His wife Rose had more, and yeah. So it's one of those curious facts that you had leading Jewish intellectuals, obviously on the left, but some of the most important intellectuals on the libertarian right were themselves of Jewish origin, though, as I said, there's one really interesting exception, of course, and that's Israel Kirzner, who is an economist, a theorist of entrepreneurship, libertarian by and large in his orientation, and he's actually an ultra-Orthodox rabbi.
Thanks very much, Jerry. I think this is a good time to end it. And thanks everybody for coming along. Hope you enjoyed it.